Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Breathwork webinar. I'm Lisa Thompson, the founder and head coach at Alpine Athletics, and I'm excited to host today's webinar along with Mountain Madness. Mountain Madness, as you probably know, has been leading climbs and mountain adventures all over the world since 1984. And together with Alpine Athletics and Mountain Madness, we're hosting some climbs this summer in the Cascades. These are really cool, all-inclusive climbs that include prep and training and a climb up the Eastern Glacier on Mount Baker, where breathwork, which is what the topic of today is, will be really important. So let's get into that. I want to introduce Tony Lorubbio, which is the founder and the head coach at Recal Training. He also is the creator of a really cool, I've used this technique myself, high breathwork training program that's specific to mountain athletes. He has multiple certifications in breathwork, including one from Oxygen Advantage, and he's currently pursuing his master's degree in exercise physiology. So Tony and I have worked together. Did I say Tony? Anthony.
Yeah, that's
Anthony.
fine. That's fine. Anthony is what I typically go by, but
I don't know
I'll
where that
definitely
came
take a
from.
Tony every now and then.
That was your one Tony of the day.
Yeah, right.
Anthony and I've worked together for more than a year at this point. He's helped me personally prepare for climbs, but also helped a number of Alpine Athletics and Mountain Madness clients as well as they're preparing for climbs all over the world. So I'm excited
Yeah.
to have him join us today. He also, the other thing I love about your work, Anthony, is that you've put theory and science of breathwork together and you've tested it out yourself on some sort of crazy adventures. So
Yeah.
let's get into that. A couple of quick notes for everyone. So we are streaming live right now on a couple of platforms, including LinkedIn and YouTube. And everyone should see a little chat button in like the lower section of your screen near the middle. So go ahead and drop us a note in there. Let us know where you're streaming in from. And if you have any mountain adventures that you're preparing for, we'd love to hear about those as well. And I'll be keeping an eye on that chat during our webinar. So if you have any questions that pop up while Anthony is talking, be sure you note it there. And then we'll take some time at the end to go through those and answer those. So that's all the logistics out of the way. We'll hand things over to you, Anthony.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, on the theory and science part of it, what is the point of theory and science if not applied to the real world? So that's kind of what my quest has been, I guess you could say, over the last few years, is to take a lot of this research and science that exists out in the world around breathwork training, especially high altitude breathwork training and respiratory muscle training, and then actually apply it to the real world so that we can do more fun stuff, climb higher, go further in the mountains. So thanks for the intro. For those of you in here now, we do have that chat window flowing already. I know there's been quite a few people that have already come in and said where they're from, what challenge they have coming up, whether that's an expedition or a race of some kind. And if you're climbing with Mountain Madness, even better. And if you've been training with Lisa through Alpine Athletics, even better. So yeah, as we go here, you can certainly drop your questions and feedback and all that sort of stuff in the chat window on whatever platform that you're watching this. Every now and then I'll be checking, of course. I'll do my best to stay up to date on this. And here and there, we'll actually open up that overlay chat window that you see throughout the webinar. So thanks for joining, everybody. I'm going to close out of that overlay. I'm also going to maximize our presentation part of the puzzle here. I'm using a fun piece of software here to actually kind of present as best as possible. So bear with me through any sort of technical snafus and things like that. But here we've got our opening. So let's go ahead and dive in. I'm excited to be here talking with you today about breath work for altitude success, how to breathe better so that you can climb higher and go further in the mountains. And what I would like to open up our discussion today with a little article that was published in Outside Magazine by somebody who maybe some of you know who this is. This is an author named Alex Hutchinson. He has the Sweat Science column within Outside. And this is what he has to say about breathing and high altitude. When you head to altitude, you have to breathe more deeply and more frequently to compensate for the scarcity of oxygen that exists in the thin air up at altitude. That means that these muscles you use to inhale, in particular, have to work harder than normal. In fact, those muscles consume 15 to 30% of the total oxygen that you'll inhale at altitude. And those muscles eventually get tired, of course. So, training these muscles should prepare you to handle that extra workload of breathing at altitude. So, I think that helps position the conversation that we're going to have today nicely in what the value is in and what the challenge is, even more than anything, in that what we face at altitude. So here is our agenda for today. What we're going to go through is what challenges your respiratory system faces at altitude. We're going to talk about what exactly I mean, and the people in my world, in this world of training of breathwork, what we really mean with breathwork training, and what the research literature has to say about breathwork training, and then applying it in the real world. Because again, that is our mission here: is to take things out of the research and into the real world. You today, over the course of the next 53 minutes, because we're going to run for about an hour and then we'll open up to Q&A, you will actually do some breath assessments, and you'll find out about how it is that you breathe and how maybe ready you are to take on some high altitude endeavors, or at least how your breathing might be either favoring and helping you, or possibly hindering and not so favorable for your endeavors that you have in the mountains. You'll also get a taste of the training. I will coach you through a few exercises today. So this is going to be pretty interactive. And then I will finish with what you can actually do from here moving forward. So that's the plan that we've got today. Just to give you a little bit more background on who exactly this Tony guy is that's speaking in front of you. Just kidding. I do normally go by Anthony. I'm just kind of making fun that Lisa called me Tony earlier. I am the founder of a company called Recal, which is short for recalibrate, as in recalibrate the way that we breathe, the way that we train to take on our mountain endeavors. Along the way of founding my company, which has our roots actually really in mindfulness as well as adventure travel, what I found was the type of adventure travel people, at least in my neck of the woods and my type of clientele that came to Recal, the type of adventure travel that they latched onto was summiting high mountains. And the type of mindfulness that they latched onto closest as well was breathwork training. And so I went down this rabbit hole of breathwork training, and I studied under Patrick McCune at Oxygen Advantage. I studied under Wim Hof through the Wim Hof method, and I also studied under the great people at Peak Flow. And what I found was not just breathwork training as a form of mindfulness practice, although it has great benefits as it relates to mindfulness. It also has an impact on your sports performance, in particular when we're talking about high altitude endeavors. And over the course of going through these instructor certifications and whatnot, and all of what I read, and then eventually experimented on myself and a lot of other athletes for a time before this was publicly available, or at least our program was publicly available, we created the High Altitude Breathwork Training Program. Now, as I said, I did do some tests on myself in a little experiment called the nasal marathon, where I trained, in quotations, trained for a marathon. Um, Prior to that, I had never run more than like 5 or 6 miles at a single time in my life, but I trained using breathwork training only. And I did not do much running at all to prep for this marathon. And then when I ran the marathon, I actually taped my mouth shut and I breathed entirely through my nose. Now, I'm not recommending that everybody goes and does this by any means, but I learned a lot about the types of, in particular, endurance adaptations that you can make in your body as it relates to breathwork training that you can do. And obviously, I learned about the power of nasal breathing as well. Well, I took that experiment to kind of the next level, no pun intended, a 14,000-foot level. And I trained at sea level for an extended period of time. And then for the first time ever, I went to high altitude, really first time for me, after going through this training. Showed up right from sea level, hiked a 14er, saw all the types of things that you can do from, again, a breathwork training translated to the mountain standpoint. I'm not the only one that's tested this since then, though, and we've obviously gone up and up and up from there. In fact, we've had a couple clients at Everest this year, which was super exciting. The first ever time that we've had clients go to Everest. But clearly, a lot more experimentation has happened. We recently, as in the last year or so, published our breathwork training program publicly. And we've now had hundreds of athletes take on breathwork training and do some fun and awesome things in the mountains. So that's a bit about me and where we've kind of led to. Let's take a pause here. We're now 11 minutes in. A lot of you have joined. A lot of you have shared some of the endeavors that you have in the mountains coming up, and all of those things. And I'm again super excited to hear about those. Let's take a moment to do a breath assessment together, shall we? This will be the first of three, as long as we have time, three breath assessments that we're going to do together. This is called a carbon dioxide tolerance test. And the way that this little assessment works is from a seated position. So if you're not already, go ahead and hop into a seat. We are going to take a normal breath in through the nose and then a normal breath out. Then you're going to take a big inhale. You're going to fill up your lungs as much as you possibly can. And when you reach the tippy top of that inhale, then you'll begin a slow exhale. You're going to try to extend that exhale as long as you can. I'm going to start a timer that's going to show on this screen. As you extend the exhale, basically you're trying to exhale as little amount of air as possible for as long as possible. Get to the point that you squeeze every last bit of air out of your lungs. You're going to feel the stress of breathlessness toward the end of that exhale. Once you've gotten all the air out of your lungs, or you just have to take a new breath, take a note of the time that's on the screen, and that is going to be your personal CO2 TT score. So I'm going to show the screen now has the timer. Go ahead once again from a seated position. Let's take a normal breath in through your nose and a normal breath out. And now begin that deep inhale. Fill up your lungs as much as you can. Fill up, fill up, fill up. And now begin that slow exhale. The air is just barely trickling out of your nose. And you're going to try to extend this exhale as long as you possibly can. As you're exhaling, just try to relax your body, relax your mind in particular as well. Get to the point that you squeeze every last bit of air out of your lungs and work with that mental stress of breathlessness. We are at 55 seconds. I'll let the timer run for just 10 more seconds. We're over the minute mark. If you're still exhaling, awesome job. And I'll stop the timer now. So if you're still exhaling, by the way, good for you. That's a nice job. Go ahead and take a couple of normal breaths just to recalibrate. Haha. Your breathing after that exam. That is the first of our breath assessments that we're going to do. Again, that is called the CO2 TT score. So whatever time was on the screen when you ran out of breath or had to take a new breath, that is your own personal carbon dioxide tolerance test. Now, you might be wondering to yourself, how good was my CO2 TT, Anthony? What are the other assessments, and how can I ultimately improve on these assessments? And what do they maybe really mean? My answer to you right now is stick around and find out. We will work through all of those answers here by the end of our session today. Let's dive into what challenges that somebody faces, in particular in their respiratory system when they arrive at altitude. And I want to make a disclaimer. I am not a medical doctor. I have studied what happens in the respiratory system at altitude. I am a multi-certified breathwork training coach, but I am not a holistic medical doctor. Of course, at any time that you are considering going to high altitude or doing something really physically challenging, always consult your doctor beforehand. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's talk about what happens in your respiratory system at altitude. The first thing that I want to touch on is typically people experience an increase in ventilation. In other words, their respiratory rate, how many breaths that you're taking per minute when you arrive at altitude. So that is challenge potentially, number one. Number two is people experience an increase in their hemoglobin concentration. In other words, those are your red blood cells. This process of increasing those red blood cells takes time. That time, you may already be familiar with this, is known as acclimatization. It's a part of the process of acclimatization, but it does take some time. So that is number two thing that happens to your respiratory system at altitude and circulatory system, of course, there as well. And the third thing that we're going to talk about here is a decrease in oxygen saturation. So if you arrive at altitude and you're wearing a pulse oximeter and you're reading your SpO2, oxygen saturation level, typically you'll notice that that number goes down from probably a 95 to 99% range. This then, of course, decreases also your total aerobic power as well as your VO2 max, your total oxygen uptake capacity when you arrive at altitude. So those are the three key things that we're touching on here as it relates to challenges you might face at altitude. So you might be thinking, all right, great. So thanks for the list of challenges. What does breathwork training actually have to do with this? So let's make that connection. Let's also along the way define what exactly we mean by breathwork training. Let's zoom right back to where we just were, which was these three challenges: increased ventilation, an increase in hemoglobin concentration, and a decrease in oxygen saturation. The way that we coach here at Recal breathwork training is using three sides. And you might already start to be picking up what I'm putting down here. The three sides to our breathwork training actually directly impact the three challenges that I just outlined. The first side of breathwork training, in the way that we coach it, is working on your mechanical efficiency. That means where and how do you actually breathe? Where do you feel the movement breathing? Where is the air going in your lungs? Are you using your nose or are you using your mouth? How fast or slow are you breathing? All of these are mechanical related elements of breathing, and we focus on trying to achieve the highest efficiency as it relates to mechanical breathing. The second side of breathwork training that we tackle here at Recal is high altitude adaptation. So there are a specific set of breathwork training protocols that you can actually simulate high altitude from wherever you are in the world, whatever level. For example, when I was at sea level before going to that 14er, I worked on a lot of high altitude simulation style breathwork training. You can make some adaptations that will pre-acclimatize your body as it prepares for altitude. And that's the high altitude adaptation side of breathwork training. And then the third side is respiratory muscle training. This one is kind of the honestly, I feel it's the biggest piece of the puzzle. Okay, you've got your mechanical efficiency, which is the foundation. You have your high altitude adaptation side of breathwork training, which is a great complement to obviously where you're about to go. But the juggernaut of it all is how strong are your breathing muscles. Respiratory muscle training is a critical part of breathwork training, and that is going to directly impact that decrease in oxygen saturation and the subsequent VO2 max that you actually have when at altitude. So let's drill in a bit on this first side of breathwork training, that mechanical efficiency side. So what can you actually do with breathwork training? Well, number one, breathwork training can fix any bad habits that you have around your breathing and improve the efficiency of your breathing. And when I say fixing bad habits, what I want you to work toward, especially at altitude, is to breathe with this equation in mind. If there's one thing, one or two things, this is probably the top two most important thing I want you to take away from this webinar, is breathe through the nose. When you're at altitude, breathe fully. I used to always coach it, breathe slow. When you're at sea level and at rest, you can breathe slow, breathe nose slow and low. At altitude, I'm starting to coach it in a slightly different way where it's breathe through the nose, breathe full, and breathe low. We want the air getting to the lowest part of the lungs. Think NFL. Nose full and low at altitude, nose slow and low, kind of in your everyday life. Number two, using breathwork training, you can eliminate the impact of dead space. That's basically underutilized space along your airway as it leads down into your lungs. There's a lot of air that gets underutilized or not utilized at all. We call that dead space. You can eliminate the impact of that dead space with each and every breath. And kind of related to that, you can increase your lung capacity and then using mechanically efficient breathing, actually use that full lung capacity. Number four, you can properly engage your diaphragm, intercostal muscles, as well as your abdomen. Those are the muscles designed to do your breathing. We can learn how to properly engage that with mechanically efficient breathing. And then lastly, we can eliminate overbreathing, which paradoxically, and I'll get into the science here soon, actually does not do your body a service. It actually lessens the oxygenation level of your body when you overbreathe. And again, in just a bit, I'll touch on the science behind that. Let's take a quick look into the literature, the research studies around mechanically efficient breathing. There was a study done a little while back that focused on slow, deep breathing at high altitude and what the subsequent oxygen saturation levels were for these test subjects. So, a quick overview of the study, some healthy lowlanders. That's low of them to call people lowlanders who live near sea level. They were climbing at 4,600 meters and then 5,400 meters. And at each of those elevation levels, they had their SpO2, their oxygen saturation levels, measured after and during 15 minutes worth of slow, deep breathing, aka mechanically efficient breathing. And what they found in conclusion was that their SpO2 levels increased by 7.6 to 9.3%. So the focus here is that just by changing the way that you breathe and doing it more in a mechanically efficient way, you can immediately find results in an increased oxygen saturation at altitude. All right, let's zoom back out now. The second side of breathwork training is what we're going to zoom into here, and that is that high altitude adaptation piece of the puzzle. Again, this is related to increasing your hemoglobin concentration or red blood cell count during acclimatization time on the mountain. Using something called intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training, which translates simply put to intermittent, going back and forth into hypoxic, meaning low oxygen. Most of you probably know that word already. Hypercapnic, hyper meaning high, capnic meaning carbon dioxide. So high carbon dioxide training, also known as high altitude simulation training, you can begin that process on your own from wherever you are in the world to increase your hemoglobin concentration. That then can subsequently result in a higher VO2 max, that total oxygen uptake capacity that you have. The second thing that you can do using this specific high altitude simulation style breathwork protocol is increase your carbon dioxide tolerance. Now, why is that important? You are going to hear me talk a lot about carbon dioxide tolerance here during the course of this webinar. And that is because it is extremely important when it comes to breathing. That feeling that you get when you're out of breath, whether you're exercising or maybe you just held your breath and tried to swim under the water as far as you could, that feeling of being out of breath is not a result, 99 times out of 100, is not a result of a lack of oxygen in the system. It is actually a response of the body to the rise in carbon dioxide. So, simply put, if you can increase your tolerance to carbon dioxide, you will then feel less out of breath. Feeling less out of breath will then decrease a very important endurance metric called rate of perceived exertion. Your body and mind are intimately connected when it comes to endurance. If you feel like you're exerting a lot of energy and your breathing has a lot to do with that, how many times you're breathing, if you feel like you're exerting a lot of energy, you're not going to go as far. But if you can decrease that RPE, rate of perceived exertion, that directly results in all the studies around endurance in more endurance. And the last piece of this puzzle around CO2 tolerance is you can prevent overbreathing. And I told you I would touch on a bit of the science of this, simply as simple as I can make it at least. When overbreathing and you're offloading carbon dioxide very, very quickly, what you're doing is you are increasing the pH of your blood? Well, the hemoglobin that you have in your blood, those red blood cells have a protein called hemoglobin. This is the protein that actually latches on to the oxygen molecule and then swims around in your circulatory system and drops off that oxygen to the place that needs it most. Say, for example, your muscles. Say it's a calf muscle because you're trekking anywhere in the world, but at high altitude, for example. The oxygen molecule and the hemoglobin has a certain affinity or a certain connection level, okay? In a high pH environment, that connection is very strong. In other words, the hemoglobin doesn't really release the oxygen very easily in a high pH environment. Remember what I said. When you're overbreathing, the pH of your blood is higher, very slightly. It could be 7.45, even 7.5 if you're really overbreathing. But in a slightly lower pH environment, lower than quote unquote homeostasis, maybe that's 7.35 or so, even 7.3, that's more acidic. That pH level has been shown to decrease the affinity between the hemoglobin and the oxygen. In other words, your hemoglobin will more easily deliver oxygen throughout your body in a slightly lower pH environment. How can you achieve a lower pH environment? By increasing your tolerance to carbon dioxide. So that's thanks for bearing with me as I tried to explain this particular scientific piece. Hopefully that made sense. If it didn't, please do drop a question in the chat window. I, of course, am happy to try to answer as many questions as we can get to throughout the course of our webinar here. So let's dive into the literature that was shown on high altitude simulation, and specifically, we're going to touch on this intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training and its impact on hemoglobin concentration and subsequent, of course, VO2 max. So there was a study done with people living at sea level. There's a lot of studies done with people at sea level. And over the course of 3 times a week for 8 weeks, they spent 30 to 45 minutes doing this intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training. Again, that's low oxygen, high carbon dioxide, high altitude simulation style breathwork training. As a result of doing that 3 times a week for 8 weeks, what they found was these athletes, specifically swimmers in this case, they were able to achieve a 5.35% higher hemoglobin concentration level, which resulted in a nearly 11% increase in VO2 max. So this shows that training anywhere in the world using this type of breathwork training protocol can increase the hemoglobin concentration that then gets you ready to take on that lower oxygen level environment like high altitude. Okay, I'm throwing a lot at you in the science. We're going to get a little bit more interactive for a moment here. We're going to go into breath assessment number 2. This is a fun one, okay? Breath assessment 2 is called location of movement. So where do you feel the movement when you're breathing? What I would like you to do is, again, from that seated position, go ahead and place one hand on your chest and then the other hand on your lower belly. What I want you to do now is breathe normally and look down the front of your body. Just take note of where you notice the movement happening when you're breathing. Do you feel it in your chest? Do you feel the expansion there? Do you feel maybe some up and down movement with the shoulders as you breathe? Do you feel it in your lower belly? And maybe even if you're sitting with a backrest against your chair, maybe you even feel it in your back. Just take one last breath normally and take note of where you feel that breathing. Go ahead and put your eyes back onto the screen that you're watching this, and you can drop your hands now. Breathing, we typically define in the world of breathwork training, we typically define it to have 3 zones of movement when it comes to breathing. Zone 1 is your lower belly or abdomen. Zone 2 is the mid chest, rib cage area. Zone 3 is upper chest and shoulders area. I have a question for you. Which zone did you feel your own movement? You can drop that in the chat window, and maybe even live time, depending on how fast we are out there, we can actually start to see some of the responses. Do, 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 do. Zone 1, Zone 2, or Zone 3? Lower belly, mid chest rib cage area, or upper chest? We have a Zone 1 from Krillin31. I have a second question for you. Awesome. We've got some ones coming in. That's great. I have a question. Which zone do you think is the most optimal place to feel breathing? So, not necessarily what you felt, but which zone do you think is the most mechanically efficient style of breathing? We've got another one. Maybe that was your own, Nicholas, or maybe that was your answer to which one is best. I don't know which one, but either way, that is what we want to see. I see a lot of zone ones. The most mechanically efficient breath is done in that lower belly abdomen space. And I know I touched on that earlier with the nose full and low concept, L being low. When breathing, the most mechanically efficient way to breathe is low into the ribs. This is where most of your gas exchange actually occurs into the bloodstream. So, thank you for entertaining me on breath assessment number 2. Let's jump back into where we were. And that is with that third side of breathwork training. Again, this is that juggernaut, as I like to consider it, of breathwork training, respiratory muscle training. Now, what do I really even mean when I say respiratory muscles? In particular, when I say that, I'm referring to your diaphragm, which, if you see on the screen here, it's that dome-shaped muscle. This doesn't look so much like a dome in this image, but it is a dome-shaped muscle just beneath your lungs. It goes 360 degrees around your thoracic cavity. And then also your intercostal muscles, the muscles in between each rib bone and your rib cage. And then there are also other muscles like your abdomen muscles or your primary exhalation muscles. These muscles that you see here are your primary inhalation muscles and some secondary ones along the way. But this is what I'm specifically referring to with those respiratory muscles. With training these muscles in particular, what you can do is, number one, you can maintain, this might be interesting for you to hear, you can maintain a higher blood oxygen saturation level at high altitude by training your respiratory muscles. And we'll get into some of the science and studies that have shown that. Number two, you can reduce respiratory muscle fatigue, also known as the metaboreflex reaction in the body. This is basically where your body, your respiratory muscles fatigue. It causes your body to consolidate the blood flow into your core and not out to your locomotor muscles. And a lot of times when people just flat out stop moving and it's not a bonk like a nutritional reason, that typically does mean that all the blood is staying in the core and not getting out to the locomotor muscles. This is the metabolic reflex. Training these muscles also can increase your ability to adapt during that acclimatization time period on the mountain. And you can also improve the breathing economy. Basically, how efficiently are you expending any energy to do your breathing because you're using the muscles that are there specifically designed to do your breathing. This results, of course, in that lower RPE, rate of perceived exertion. Now, I do want to note, we coach it at Recal to focus both on inspiratory muscles as well as expiratory muscles. This is all about gas exchange, especially at altitude. Gas in and gas out with each and every breath. Now, let's take a look at the literature and what some studies have to show on specifically inspiratory muscle training. I'm going to focus a bit more on that just because the air is thin at high altitude. And because that air pressure is lower there than, say, at sea level, it takes more effort for you to inhale that air into the lungs. So this is really an important piece of the puzzle. Not saying expiratory is not, but inspiratory muscles are a critical element to keeping your SpO2 levels higher at altitude. So what does this first study show? It took a group of people that were going on an expedition into the Himalayas, and leading up to that expedition, 2 times a day for 4 weeks, these individuals did some inspiratory muscle training. Specifically, they did a 50% air resistance trainer. They used a 50% air resistance trainer to inhale against that air resistance. And if everybody out there has two nostrils, if you block one nostril, that would be 50% inhalation resistance. And that is your own little version of an inspiratory muscle training exercise. Anyway, at the levels of sea level, 400 meters, 1,400 meters, 4,880, and 5,550 meters high, they were tested in what their SpO2 or oxygen saturation levels were. In conclusion, as a result of their training, their inhalation strength increased by about 15%. This is done by something called MIP, your mouth inhalation pressure, basically, the strength at which you can actually inhale. So that's great. They actually got stronger as a result of this. Now, how exactly did that translate to the mountain itself? And what the study found was that there was no change for these individuals, the group that did the training versus the group that didn't. There was no difference between those groups at below 4,880 meters. Now, there's a big gap between 1,400 and 4,880, so maybe not the most perfect study ever, but what they did find, though, was that at that 4,880 meter and above level, on average, there was a 6% increase in the oxygen saturation level, and as much as 10% in some of these individuals. So here is an example of a way that you can train to build the strength of your respiratory muscles. And then when you arrive at the thinner air at altitude, that's going to then allow you to keep your oxygenation levels higher. Note that this is not in any way changing the way that these people breathed. This was just purely gauging the SpO2 levels. The first study that we looked at was actually changing the way in which they breathe. So now just imagine if you put those two together, we are breathing strong, my friends, and we are keeping our oxygen saturation levels high. So now the big question is or at least the question that I felt that I faced and my team here at Recal faced a few years ago, how do we take all of this stuff out of the lab and out of the research books and into the real world? And this was when, over the course of time, we created, at least initially, a 5-week breathwork training program. Now, we of course can address different lengths of time, but this specifically is a last 5 weeks before your expedition, the pre-acclimatization block of fitness that you might be facing. This breathwork training program fits right into that last 5 weeks. We've launched that now over a year ago, and we've had since then hundreds of athletes go through this training now. We've had people trekking at Everest Base Camp. We've had people climb Kilimanjaro, for example. We've had people run in some of the high altitude ultra races. We've had IFMGA, AMGA certified mountain guides. People climbing Cotopaxi. A lot of different applications have been used with this breathwork training. We've also been lucky and fortunate enough to have been featured in the media a few different times. It's all been fine and dandy and fun, right? But no, it does mean a lot to me to see that we are actually making an impact in the real world and not just, of course, sticking to that theory and science behind breathwork training. So for the duration of the rest of our time, what I want to do with you is actually train you in doing some breathwork training, right? I want you to finish out those breath assessments. So we'll do that third one. And then I want to actually coach you through one exercise that will help you with your carbon dioxide tolerance. Remember that critical component of breathwork training. We're going to talk a little bit about what you can do from here. We can talk about some of the situational things that happen on the mountain and how breathwork training can address those. And that's where Lisa will kind of come back into the conversation. We'll have some dialogue back and forth. And then we'll finish up after that hour mark with some Q&A. So let's go into the third breath assessment now. This is going to be your most challenging breath assessment, okay? So get yourself mentally prepared for this. This is called a maximum breathlessness test. By the way, if you don't want to do this, no problem. If you're also sitting in your office and you think it'd be a little weird to, this involves walking around while holding your breath, by the way. If you think you'll feel a little weird doing that, no problem. Just sit this one out. Maybe just observe how I'm coaching it and then do it on your own. But this is called a maximum breathlessness test. The way that this works is from a standing position to begin, you're going to take a normal breath in, a normal breath out. At the bottom of that passive and natural exhale, You're going to pinch your nose and hold your breath and begin walking. As you walk, count your steps. The metric that we use for this assessment test is the number of steps that you can take on that one breath hold after exhalation. So I'm going to go ahead and guide you through this now. So for those of you that are joining me in this little endeavor of a breath assessment, go ahead and stand up if not already. Relax into your breathing. We're just going to take a couple of normal breaths together. So with me, go ahead and take a normal breath in and a normal breath out. We're going to do one more breath together. Go ahead and inhale normally and exhale. And at the bottom of that exhale, go ahead and pinch your nose, hold your breath, and begin walking. Count your steps along the way. For those of you walking and still listening, don't forget the number of steps that you take. It's going to be stressful at the end of this breath hold. Stay mentally sharp and remember the number of steps you take. Go as long as you can on this one held breath. Whenever you can't go any further, make your way on back. Give yourself that gratified breathing of recovery breaths and settle back in to the space that you're watching. So hopefully you all are done walking. I can't imagine anyone still walking at this point. So the number of steps that you took there is your personal MBT, or maximum breathlessness test. So you might be wondering, all right, we've got the maximum breathlessness test, you have the location of movement, and then we also did that carbon dioxide tolerance test. What do your scores mean, and what are the range that we're shooting for on all of these? So here's a little chart, okay? Don't freak out too much in seeing the words dysfunctional versus functional. Stick with me here, let me explain. So the first metric you see on this assessment score range is something called a BOLT score. We did not do that breath assessment, but if you were to sign up for one of our trainings, of course that is included. Or even if you just see some of the materials that we have on our community platform, there's a lot about the BOLT score. But what we did do was the CO2 TT and the MBT. If your CO2 TT was in the score range of 20 to 40, that's on the lower side, that may be a sign that you have some dysfunctional breathing happening, some habit that we need to clean up. If you're at 40 to 60, it's better, but still there's probably something that we can clean up. The threshold that I like to see with my clients and people that are out there doing high altitude endeavors is 60. If you're above 60, that's typically a sign that you have functional breathing habits. Same goes for your MBT, same exact range. It's just done in the number of steps. If you walked between 20 and 40 steps, that's on that low side. 40 to 60 is good, I guess you could say, or not good, it's fair. Above 60, we're in the good range. If you are out there and your goal coming up here soon is Kilimanjaro, for example, MIT Beaver, you said you're from Seattle, that's near sea level, you're climbing Kilimanjaro in September. If you have that goal, I would love to see you above an 80 on that CO2 TT and the MBT. It might seem like that is a very far way away, but trust me, making some of these adaptations actually comes fairly quickly, especially when it relates to carbon dioxide tolerance. These are attainable, and that's what you can do with some breathwork training. Of course, by the way, that second assessment was the LOM. We talked about that. We want you to breathe in that zone 1 area. The lower abdominal region is where the movement would be happening there. So let's do a little breathwork training exercise. Specifically here, we're going to do something called breathe light. This is directly related to carbon dioxide tolerance. So as I mentioned, the reason why somebody feels out of breath when exercising or even at high altitude, there is some oxygen at play there, but moving your body increases the carbon dioxide in the blood, and that sends your chemoreceptors in a bit of a tizzy, and they try to get you to exhale off that carbon dioxide. If we can train that CO2 tolerance, we can then feel less out of breath, which from there, then we can breathe more mechanically efficient because we're not just out of breath all the time. We can also harness the Bohr effect, which is that concept of the hemoglobin releasing oxygen throughout the body more efficiently. That's called Bohr effect. And it's kind of a cascade from there. This is a foundational piece piece of breathwork training, carbon dioxide tolerance. So from a seated position, sitting up with a straight back, but relaxed shoulders, relaxed arms, I want you to take your pointer finger and place it just beneath your nose, resting on your upper lip. Go ahead and take a couple of normal breaths in and out through your nose and notice the air as it runs across your finger on the way in and then back out across your finger on the way out. You might notice some cooler air on the way in and then some warmer, maybe more moisture in the air on the way out. Now that you have a feeling for what that air feels like on your finger, go ahead and start to slow down your breathing. So much so that you can barely feel the air as it runs across your finger. If you're holding on to any tension in your shoulder while keeping your finger there, try to relax. And as you're breathing so slowly now, you can barely feel the air run across your finger. You might start to feel this sensation of air hunger, the feeling like you need to take a much bigger breath. That is called air hunger. That is your carbon dioxide rising in the blood. What we're doing here for this exercise is slowing down the breathing so much so that you invite that feeling of air hunger, which can be very challenging. And I want you to try to sit with that feeling for the next minute or so. Breathing very slowly in and out through your nose. Try to keep control of your breathing on the way in. Try to keep control of your breathing on the way out. Sometimes it's very challenging, especially at the bottom of the exhale and at the top of the inhale. Your body might be trying to force you to take a bigger breath. Do your best to control the breathing. We're here for the next 20 seconds. You can do it. We've got just 10 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good. Go ahead and relax your finger away from your nose. Take a couple of normal breaths now to recover. That is called breathe light. If you did not have that feeling of air hunger, what that means is either you were breathing too fast for your own personal carbon dioxide tolerance, so try to slow it down even more, or you need to do that exercise for a little while longer. If that was extremely challenging for you and your breathing got very erratic and you were just full of that air hunger feeling, maybe breathe a little bit faster or just do it in shorter spurts. But this is a great exercise, a nice foundational entry level exercise for you to do to start that CO2 tolerance training work. Now let's talk about some of the other exercises that you can do as a part of your respiratory, or excuse me, your breathwork training program. One of them in the range of respiratory muscle training is the inspiratory muscle training exercise called hook lying diaphragmatic breathing. It's called hook lying because of the position that you're in. Your feet are flat on the ground, your knees are at a 90-degree angle, and you're lying down on the ground, as you see the person here showing this hook lying position. What you want to do in this position is take strong inhales and engage your diaphragm. The way that you can actually make this more challenging, though, is if you block one nostril to create that 50% air resistance. That will challenge your diaphragm and it'll make it work harder to actually pull in the air into your lungs. You can also add weight to your lower belly, or you can put a resistance band, something like a Buteyko belt is the specific one that we use in our trainings, is a resistance band around your lower belly to resist that space so that it becomes harder for you to expand in the lower belly. Doing this can train that diaphragm muscle to build that muscle so that you can handle the workload that it's going to need to face when you arrive at altitude. Another respiratory muscle training exercise that we coach is something in the realm of expiratory muscle training, and that is called balloon breathing. Yes, even kids can do balloon breathing. This is a fun one, but doing a lot of it's not so fun. I'll explain why. What you do is, with a balloon in hand, You take full inhales to get as much air as you can into your lungs, and then you take strong, forceful exhales into the balloon. You try to exhale to blow up that balloon as much as you can, collapsing down into that abdominal space. And then when you can't exhale anymore, you release the balloon from your lips, let the air go out, inhale again, and go once again. You try to fill up that balloon as many times as you can in 1 minute. One way that you can actually make this more challenging is in a 90-90 position, as you see in the picture here, with your feet up against a wall, knees at a 90-degree angle. This exercise can help train your abdominal muscles, which are your primary exhalation muscles. And then lastly, the last exercise that I'll explain that you can do on your own potentially is a walk to jog variation of high altitude simulation. This is also known as that intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training. The way that it works is it actually begins similar to how you did that maximum breathlessness test. From a standing position to begin, you take a normal breath in, a normal breath out, you pinch your nose and hold your breath and begin walking. As you can see in the diagram, that flat line there to begin, that's you holding your breath. You go until you reach a level of strong, I actually oftentimes coach a medium level of air hunger. At that point, you begin jogging. You can see how this becomes extremely difficult. This is also known as mental resilience training. You go as long as you can on that one breath held in that jog. And when you need to take a breath, you release your nose, but instead of taking big breaths, you actually take 6 minimal breaths. This is going to trick your diaphragm into thinking it's taking a full breath. It's going to try to force an inhale by contracting. This helps to strengthen your diaphragm actually, but ultimately it's really helping you with that CO2 tolerance. Potentially, depending on your CO2 tolerance, you're also getting slightly hypoxic in this as well, hence the simulation of altitude there. Then you take a few normal breaths to recover and then repeat it for as many as 5 times in a row. So this is that high altitude simulation style breathwork training. This will be the last exercise that I describe for you. Of course, if you want to know more exercises, you can either drop some questions in the chat, or you can visit that community platform, which I'll give you a link here at the end of our session. We've got so many exercises on that platform, as well as guided weekly training sessions that I coach every Monday morning, Mountain Time at 8:04 a.m. I'll tell you later why 8:04. But let's talk a little bit now about what about on the mountain itself? And I'm going to invite Lisa back into the conversation here as well. So let's discuss some situations. So Lisa, what are some situations in all of your experience? And by the way, for those of you that maybe don't even know this, I don't know, Lisa, that you gave much of an introduction, but you are the second ever US-based woman to climb K2. So for those of you that didn't know that, I'm throwing that out there. Lisa has done some incredible things in the mountains and knows what she's talking about. So you probably know a few situations that breathwork could come into play, right?
For sure. And since you and I started working together a year or so ago, it's really made me think about how I'm breathing on the mountain. And you've helped me troubleshoot different situations where I felt like I maybe wasn't breathing as efficiently as I could have been. So I wanted to share that experience today in hopes of giving people some real-time tips and tools that they can use if they find themselves in similar situations when they're climbing. So the first one is actually depicted in this photo. And I know there's a number of people on the webinar today who are getting ready to climb Rainier. And it's become common lately that there are vertical ladders on Mount Rainier. And so if we're, say, approaching something like a ladder or some situation where we know that our exertion is going to increase significantly, how do you recommend we begin to breathe in preparation for that change in intensity?
So that is a good question. Good situation there. What I would focus on with breathing in this situation is something that is not going to send you too far up, but it's also not going to send you too far down in a relaxed state, because we need some level of focus, but a calm, ready to go kind of focus, right? And I'm going to throw out 2 protocols that you can do back to back. When arriving at the ladder, if you feel like your heart's starting to race and you feel very, very nervous about what you're about to take on, one of the quickest way that you can downshift the nervous system to regain control of that mental composure is something called a physiological sigh. And the way that a physiological sigh works is you take a double inhale through the nose and then an exhale through the mouth. What that's going to do is it's going to offload CO2 very quickly, which oftentimes happens with an increased heart rate. Our CO2 levels start to skyrocket. We can offload CO2 quickly, downshift the nervous system, and then we at least can be under control to begin a second breathwork protocol called box breathing. Maybe some of you know that out there. It's a nice, even breathing, maybe on a 4 count or a 3 count, if we might struggle with a 4 count at altitude, where you're just inhaling for a count of 3, holding for a count of 3, exhaling for a count of 3, and then holding again for a count of 3. This will balance your system. So you're not going to be too calm. So you're about ready to rest and digest the food that you just ate, but you're also not completely sympathetic where it's like fight or flight response, right? So it's a nice balance. So I would pair those two things together before getting on that ladder, the physiological sigh and then a box breathing.
And I love the physiological side because you and I have talked about this. Like you can use that like if you're in a meeting and things are getting tense or you're in an argument with someone, that's a good way to just sort of calm things down a little bit.
Yes, absolutely.
So the next scenario actually happened when I was on K2. So this was before you and I started working together about breathwork. And I sort of meticulously measure my oxygen saturation when I'm climbing. And I woke up in the morning. This was at an elevation of, probably 25,000 feet or so. So we weren't yet breathing bottled oxygen. But I woke up and my SpO2 was 37, plus or minus, right? Because it's sort of a cheapy, Amazon purchase to measure, but still incredibly low. And so my initial reaction was shock and also concern. I had to go climb, right? I had to get up out of my sleeping bag and get ready to go and start like expecting my body to perform. And I really didn't have any tools at the time to help get that saturation as high as it possibly could be, given the elevation and the circumstance I was in.
Right. Right. Well, okay. So that's a pretty extreme example of a situation.
I know. If you wonder why I'm missing brain cells, this is why.
Yeah. Well, okay. I'm going to give you the ultimate breathwork protocol for that situation. Normally, by the way, for those of you maybe not on K2 and having an SpO2 of 37%, I would say something as simple as a light, slow, deep breathing pattern, maybe a count of 5 on the way in and a count of 5 on the way out. That actually will increase that SpO2 level. There's a lot of studies that have been done with that specific protocol. But that's for folks that are likely just, they're not trying to summit K2 in that morning. So I'm going to give you a more extreme example. This is actually something we call recovery breathing, but it's going to work really well in this situation. The way that we coach recovery breathing, and oftentimes people can do this after an acclimatization hike, but if you need to supercharge your system to like get you ready to go and drastically change your SpO2 in a moment's notice, what you can do is recovery breathing. It pieces together 2 protocols. The first protocol is controlled hyperventilation. And I know that sounds maybe very intense, but it's intense for a reason. When we are at high altitude and we have an SpO2 like 37%, we need to get oxygen into the bloodstream. Like without question, we got to get it in, right? We got to change that oxygen saturation level. So what you can do is find a place to lay down on the ground, not even from a seated position, definitely not standing. Find a place to lay down on the ground, lie down on the ground. My 5th grade English teacher is not happy with me. And you do a round of 15 to 20 deep breaths, fairly fast as well. We are controlled hyperventilation. After those 15 to 20 deep breaths, you then go into breathe light, which is what we actually just did a moment ago. So the reason why we want to pair those 2 things together is the controlled hyperventilation period of this protocol, it shuttles oxygen into the bloodstream. The second piece of this protocol is it gets oxygen out of the bloodstream and into the muscles and the tissue that actually need it for the moment that's about to behold, which is climbing K2, right? it's a two-step process. We don't just want oxygen in the bloodstream. It doesn't really serve us just to be in the bloodstream. We want oxygen then out of the bloodstream and into the muscle tissue, which is where Breathe Light comes in. That'll drop the pH level of the blood. And remember, that will allow the hemoglobin to release oxygen into the muscle tissue and organs that need it. So does that protocol make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And it's something that is easily done too, just lying in your sleeping bag, right?
Yeah.
Like, very simple. In fact,
Best
I
place to
wonder
do it.
if it
Keep
just makes
yourself
sense
warm
to make
as well.
that. Absolutely. It probably just makes sense to do that sort of like as you start your day if you're at high elevation, right? There's no risk of just like making it a part of what you do when you're like making a hot beverage and getting everything ready.
Yep, I typically coach my athletes and clients up on doing that 2 to 3 times a day during their
Okay.
acclimatization phase on the mountain. Yeah.
Yeah. Great advice. And I know some
Yep.
people have to drop off because they're at the top of the hour, but maybe just one other quick one. And this
Yep.
happened to me recently. I was climbing in Mexico and I just felt like I couldn't catch my breath.
Hmm.
And, I don't recall exactly the elevation, but maybe it was 16,000 feet. So it was not the
Yep.
highest I'd ever been. It was not the most difficult climb I'd ever been on. And of course, I very quickly thought, well, I'm just undertrained and getting older.
No.
But it also occurred to me that I have this incredible tool with me all the time, which is my breath. And there's probably a better way that I could be breathing as I'm continuing to move forward and
Right.
upward on the mountain.
Yeah. Yep. That's a good one. And by the way, feeling out of breath is not an indication of fitness levels. I hear that so much. It really is a targeted piece of the puzzle, which is your carbon dioxide tolerance. People that are in incredible shape may still feel out of breath just purely because their CO2 tolerance isn't particularly strong. That's fine. Those are two separate things, but I'm just at least helping get you out of that
Thanks,
negative
Anthony.
thought. You're very welcome. So specific to this moment, I'm going to keep it simple. We're just going to go right back to one of the protocols that I mentioned a moment ago, which is the physiological sigh. So in the moment that you feel very out of breath, like you just cannot catch your breath, do 3 to 4 physiological sighs in a row. No more than 4, though. And again, that's a double inhale through the nose and an exhale through the mouth. Basically, a normal inhale through the nose. That small pause will slightly deflate the alveoli in your lungs. And then that extra inhale, that jolt is going to reinflate those alveoli, which is going to continue to collect that CO2 from the blood. And then through the mouth, that big airway, you're letting it go, right? And if you do 3 to 4 of those in a row, you will likely be able to regain control of your breathing because that CO2 level just drops significantly in the blood. When you have regained control of your breathing in that way, then focus on that nose full and low protocol. It's not even a protocol. It's an every day, every moment of your moving on the mountain. You should be thinking, breathe through the nose, breathe deep and full, and breathe low, trying to get that air into the lowest part of your lungs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so this was good. I'm really happy that we were able to go through some of these situational breathing protocols. Even in our training, of course, we cover this. It's how to breathe, period, on the mountain. That's that nose full and low. I talked about some of that recovery breathing, and we even have a protocol if you're starting to feel symptoms of acute mountain sickness. We address that as well with a specific protocol. So let's for the next, we're kind of at 3 more minutes, I would say, worth of my time talking, and then we'll be able to jump into the questions. Let's go into a few different case studies here on what people have done using breathwork training on the mountain. I'll try to fly through these as quick as I can. We've had groups climb at Everest or trek at Everest Base Camp. So specifically a group this past year, a group of 7 went from London, that's not particularly high elevation, and they went and trekked at Everest Base Camp, and they provided a lot of the feedback that you see on the screen here. Both Matt and Nigel were a part of that group of 7. We've also had a lot of clients climb Mount Cotopaxi as well. In fact, a group of 16 went last year and climbed Cotopaxi after, as a group, doing the training together. Groups oftentimes train better together, is what I find. There's a lot of accountability structures to that and whatnot. So the likes of folks like Ron and Catherine were a few clients, a part of that group of 16 that climbed Cotopaxi, and they had great experience from the breathwork training translating on the mountain for them. And then there's also mountains like Aconcagua, where the typical success rate is 30 to 35%, for example, a summit success rate. In our first season, this past season, we partnered with a guiding company down at Aconcagua. Had a lot of their clients, almost all of their incoming clients for this one specific segment of their guiding programs, did the breathwork training. We experienced across those clients, it was over 25 that did it, a 71% success rate. So that is quite substantial. It's over double in the amount of success rate as a result of doing the breathwork training. And one specific case study, and Lisa, I know you know this person very well, is Dave Taylor. He did both your training program and mine, but in his first attempt at Aconcagua, he did catch or come down with HAPE, the pulmonary edema, and he was taken off the mountain at 6,000 meters. But then during his second attempt, he had decided to approach things a bit differently in working with Lisa here through Alpine Athletics, and did the mountaineering fitness training program that she offers. And then for the tail end of that program, in about the last 2 months before he departed, he also underwent our breathwork training program. And this is, as you can see here, me and him working together, going through his training program. And in some of his fitness data, you can see at the fitness level at the start of his previous attempt was a base of 57. That was his base fitness level. And of course, that was his unsuccessful attempt. At the start of doing his mountaineering training program with Lisa, his base fitness level was a 76. Then, over the course of those months working in that mountaineering fitness program, he reached a 92, which at that point is when he started the breathwork training program. And ultimately, in combining both the mountaineering fitness program as well as the breathwork training program, he ended at a 122 base fitness metric score. And this is on the Coros watch that he wears. And that's what he brought with him to the mountain. As he reports, it was a drastically different experience. He was able to consistently maintain a 95% SpO2 on his climb. He said his heart rate was way more under control. His summit push had a maximum of 145. He hovered around 107 consistently, whereas his previous attempt was 160 at times, consistently at 140 and 150. So extremely different outcome there. Also, his sleep and his hyperventilation levels were completely different compared to his first attempt. And through, I think, the training through you, as well as the breathwork training in particular, training that mental resilience also resulted in a successful summit for our friend Dave. So these are some of the case studies from Kilimanjaro to Cotopaxi to Everest Base Camp Trek to Aconcagua. We've had great results through the breathwork training. Now, to wrap up my talking, at least, where can you go from here? So if you want to try some breathwork training out yourself, starting as soon as Monday, actually, you can find recordings all over the place on our YouTube channel. But if you want to actually go through a guided session with me on Monday morning at 8:04 Mountain Time, AM, I coach a weekly live stream training session. That QR code that you see there is where you can go to actually RSVP to join a training session on that Monday. We start at 8:04 a.m. I promised you that I would answer this question because that is the 29,000th 32nd second of the day, which is the equivalent of the feet of Everest in height. So ha ha ha, yes, I know. Super cheesy, but also awesome. The second thing that you can do beyond even joining a training session in the morning, Join our Basecamp platform. This is our community platform. It's offered to so many mountain athletes. We have hundreds of athletes inside our community already. And we offer that free live stream coaching session, but also a bunch of stories from the mountain with other mountaineers providing inspiration, exercise videos, coaching tips, monthly webinars and FAQ sessions. Also, we've got posted tons of different FAQs on what exercises would do this and this and this. We address all of that type of stuff on our community platform. So those are free resources out there. Again, that's that free training session, community platform. We also have some paid training plans, and there's 3 ways in which we do our paid training plans, and that is the highest level of investment would be a personal training package at $875. The second way, and this is our most popular package, is the online video course. So you go through the 5-week program with videos, demonstrations of the exercises, written descriptions, as well as a workbook that takes you through this, and that is $275. And then the most accessible version of our training program is at $75. That's a self-guided, what you get there is basically a workbook, and you can work through that book on your own. We do offer a Training Peaks program as well through the app Training Peaks if you use that. The QR code there sends you basically to a custom URL that was created for our Mountain Madness webinar. I do have some special offers to everybody on this particular webinar. You can find those specials at this QR code. But number one is if you do sign up for the $275 package that, again, is that online training, and there's at least 5 of you out there that do it together, I will host 3 coaching sessions with you as a group. So you'll be getting some of the benefits from a personal training package, but just as a group. Key, though, is the registration would need to be done by June 2nd. That's when we would start this program as a group. Secondly, of course, the special offer is the free training session to all of you on Monday morning. Recordings are always available, but also I want to offer you the opportunity to answer that question of, is my breathing expedition ready? And that is where we can book a free 20-minute assessment call where we go through some breath assessments together and coach you up on what's the best way to approach your breathwork training. I have you on here, Lisa, because I want to make this awkward. No, I'm just kidding. You obviously, I'm so humbled to hear what you have to say about what you've seen through people that have done this breathwork training program. I have a quote here that you shared with me a little while back in just, saying that you can't overstate the value of the breathwork training program, and that our program can be a game changer for people looking to optimize their experience on the mountain, whether that is they're a first-time high altitude trekker or somebody aiming for a high altitude technical summit. You've seen the difference. So I want to thank you so much for those kind words. And with that, go ahead, Lisa.
No, I was going to say it's my pleasure. Absolutely.
Let's open it up to Q&A now. I think we can dive into the chat window and see what types of questions are there.
Yeah, there's one from Mr. Green Flash, which is curious how your breath work might help with trail running at lower elevations.
So the thing about breathwork training in general is it is going to help address endurance from any elevation. It just happens to be that, of course, we focus on the place that we might be at what's the word I'm looking for? A scarcity level of oxygen, of course, in high altitude. But without question, the things you can do, especially from a respiratory muscle training standpoint, in training these muscles to do your breathing more efficiently, whether you're at sea level or at high altitude, that's going to make a big difference. But maybe even more than anything, Mr. Green Flash, is that carbon dioxide tolerance training. If you can focus on that, that would be my recommendation. If you can focus on that, you're going to then feel less out of breath. And if you feel less out of breath, you're going to be able to maintain better breathing mechanics when you're running. And what this is going to do, if you're really a nut about your fitness levels and maybe you train most of your trail running at, say, a zone 2 aerobic threshold level, what you may be able to experience if you train that CO2 tolerance is that you're able to keep that respiratory rate a little bit lower than you normally would have otherwise. If you keep your respiratory rate lower because you're able to breathe more slowly, your heart rate is going to stay slightly lower as well. And that heart rate, of course, is that zone 2 threshold, metric that we use. And what I've had a lot of trail runners find, especially those that have run, yes, some high altitude stuff, Leadville 100, Bear 100. I've got a client now doing, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name, one of the biggest in Hard Rock 100. What they have found is by training that CO2 tolerance is they're able to keep the heart rate at the same level that there used to be their aerobic threshold, but they're actually getting more distance out of that same threshold. So you at a higher intensity level of running, a higher pace, you're able to keep your respiratory rate lower and your heart rate lower, and that's going to obviously result in much more effective training throughout your trail running. That was a long-winded answer. I really hope that helped, though.
No, it's really useful, and it's just a good reminder of how effective this stuff is and what a difference it makes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I think those are all of our questions, unless there's anything else that anybody's curious about before we sign off for today.
Cool. You guys, you all kept it pretty easy for me with these questions.
Yeah.
Sweet. Well, yes. I will email everybody that at least RSVP directly on our community platform or through one of our pop-ups on our website and link to the recording. But if you aren't one of those people, go ahead and email me at anthony@recaltravel.com or go to that website, recaltravel.com/mountainmadness. And from there, you can do all the things that we talked about. You can either book a training, you can book an assessment call with me, you can get this recording there as well, and all the other resources. But yeah, Lisa, I want to thank you so much for inviting me and having me come in and speak. And I hope I did a good job in representing what we can do with better breathing on the mountain.
Yeah, for sure. This was a lot of very useful information that I'm sure people will start to implement and use to let them adventure more and safer and longer in the mountains. So thanks a lot, Anthony. I appreciate it.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. See you later. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.